All right, so time to get into the core content for this week's episode. We're going to talk a little bit about how to deal with a flight cancellation or a delay that's going to create a misconnection and screw up your travel plans, make it more difficult to get to your final destination. So for this one, I've got a couple of different stories that came up recently that got me thinking about this and sort of forced me to assemble my notes on best practices and things to do. So I'm going to start out with a ticket that we booked for a customer that was coming back from Europe. We booked an award ticket on the outbound separately, and then the return trip was actually a separate reservation. So this was one of those situations where it can be even more problematic if you have a delay because he wasn't booked all the way through from his departure airport to his final destination. And so in this case, it was a Flying Blue award ticket from Paris to Washington, D.C., and then the final destination was Miami, and so we had used British Airways to book a direct flight on American and get him all the way to his final destination. So I talked with Fritz, and he was nice enough to let me share this story. So thank you very much to you, Fritz. Hopefully some of you guys can learn from this and can make things easier if something like this comes up. So first up, Fritz got to the airport in Paris and found out that the flight to Washington, D.C. had been canceled. And so when he contacted me, the first step was going to be to cancel the separate ticket from D.C. to Miami that was booked through British Airways on American. And that was actually a pretty straightforward, simple cancellation. Depending on how close to the actual departure time of that flight, you may not get your miles back, or you may have to call British Airways and do some extra work to get the miles refunded. But they've actually recently improved their cancellation policy quite a bit, where you can cancel a lot of tickets online. And if you do that, they just deduct $55 from the refund of taxes and fees. And so if your taxes were less than $55, you won't get any money back, but you won't actually have to pay a change fee. So with British Airways, the maximum change fee for canceling an award ticket and getting those miles back is whatever you pay in taxes. And then if it's more than $55, they give you the taxes back. So first up, went through and canceled the British Airways ticket. This is one spot where you need to be aware of which program booked your ticket, because it's not always going to be the same as the airline that's operating your flight. So in this case, American Airlines was operating the flight from Washington to Miami, but we needed to contact British Airways to make this cancellation. And so it was their record locator, the British Airways record locator, that was necessary to be able to log in and manage that reservation and make the cancellation. So in other words, if I had called American since they were operating the flight, or tried to log in on the American website, wouldn't have been able to deal with that part of the itinerary. So good news on that front, $5.60 in taxes were forfeited, and the 7,500 miles were refunded to Fritz's British Airways account. Then it's on to the much more complicated issue of figuring out how to rebook this flight from Paris and get him all the way to Miami. Now, one thing that is kind of counterintuitive, but is really important to be aware of with cancellations, is that a lot of times the airline will be willing to work with you to get you to a different destination. So it was potentially going to be a real pain if Air France required Fritz to go to Washington, D.C. anyways, because then we would still have to book another flight to Miami on another day, a whole bunch of additional hassle. And so I think the first step when you've got a cancellation situation is to know your alternative options and try and come to the airline that you're approaching about rebooking you with some ideas in mind, and if at all possible, ideas about which flights are available. Because in this particular case, when I called Air France Flying Blue, they were totally booked on the next two flights to Washington, D.C., because most of the people that were on that canceled flight actually wanted to go to Washington. But Fritz, since he was going to Miami, it turned out to be really easy for them to put him on the next day's outbound flight to Miami. So that was a really big win, and it's important to have just a list of those flights. Typically with a cancellation, even if you booked with miles, you don't have to worry about having flights that you want to rebook to be available for as a mileage ticket. Typically, if something happens, it's a cancellation that's the airline's fault. They're going to rebook you in any available seat. So in other words, you can use a search engine like Kayak or Google Flights to explore your options to get to your destination. Generally, though, you do need to be looking for the same airline. So it is possible for an airline like Air France to rebook you on Delta or another partner. Airlines have arrangements and just basically contracts with one another so that they can offer that service, but they really prefer to put you on their own flight. And so unless things are looking really grim, it costs them a lot more money to put you on another airline. And so at least to start, you want to be looking for options that you can get to your final destination with the same flight, with the same airline. So the next thing that came up and was a little bit of a wrench in the operation of getting this changed was that by the time Fritz found out that his flight to Washington was canceled, he had already checked in for that flight and was already at the airport. And with a lot of airlines, once you check in for your flight, whether it's at the check-in counter or online prior to departure, the reservation goes under airport control. And so that just basically means that the phone agents may not be able to make changes and put you on that other flight without somebody at the airport undoing that check-in process. So this kind of gets us to the next stage of the process. Fritz gave me a call from the Paris airport, and he was in this huge line. Just obviously tons of other people on this flight that needed to get rebooked. And so, his estimate was like, maybe it was going to be a 2-hour line to get up front and actually be able to talk with somebody about rebooking his flight. So the first thing to keep in mind if you're already at the airport is that it can be way faster to get on the phone. And even if that doesn't work, it's a great idea to get on the phone while you're in line, if at all possible, so that, at least even if both have a long wait time, whichever one answers first, whether you get to the front of the line at the airport or whether you get to the front of the queue for the call center, it can potentially cut down a lot of time on your total waiting to get the resolution. One other idea, if you're at the airport already, is that sometimes the airline VIP lounges are able to sort out rebookings for you. And so if you already have lounge access with the airline you're flying, either because you're in business class and you've already gone through security, or you just have lounge access because you've purchased it with the airline, that can be a way to be able to deal with, number one, agents who are not super stressed out with hundreds of other people in line. They're going to be a little bit more relaxed and probably willing to spend a little bit more time working on a solution for you. So if you can find a way to work with the lounge agents at the airline for the airline that's operating your flight, that can be a great solution. Another potential shortcut is, and this is especially important if the reason for the delay or cancellation is something like weather, where if it's just one flight because of a mechanical issue, the airport's going to be a problem, but the call center is probably going to be fine. If it's a weather-related thing, sometimes the phones are just as jammed as the queue at the airport. So another tip here is if hold times are long, consider searching for an international call center. So for example, with American Airlines, I have a lot of success calling the Australia, New Zealand, or Brazil phone numbers. You can find those super easy on Google, and generally the calls are pretty cheap, like in the 2 to 3 cents per minute range if you use Skype and Skype credit. So as long as you've got a connection at the airport on Wi-Fi and you have Skype on your phone, you should be able to make a call using the Skype app rather than getting charged a ton by your wireless carrier for an international call. And Skype can make it possible to get through to a call center that just doesn't have the overwhelming number of people that are trying to get rebooked. All right, so in this situation, the issue of the ticket being under airport control was a bit of a problem. And so when I called Air France to try and get this rebooked, what they were able to do was to just basically save a seat, protect a seat for Fritz on the direct flight from Paris to Miami. And so like I said, the fact that he was hoping to go to Miami instead of Washington turned out to be an advantage. And even though that wasn't his original destination, they were happy to make make that rebooking. But it ended up taking a couple of phone calls because the call center wasn't able to do anything until somebody at the airport removed the check-in. Now, the way they explained it to me the first time, it sounded like there was no hope until he talked to somebody at the airport. But I wanted to share that my experience with this was that I ended up calling back and escalating to a supervisor, and somebody at the Air France call center was able to actually remove that airport controller, was able to liaison with somebody at the airport and get that part fixed. So, if they say you need to remove the check-in or do something at the airport, that might be true, but you may want to give it a couple of tries by phone and just see if somebody can find a way to solve the problem for you. And then the last thing is that if you are stuck with waiting for somebody at the airport, sometimes the main customer service desk with that huge line isn't going to be the only place where they can remove your check-in. So if you've got a solution by phone, you may be able to deal with some other airline staff. If the only thing they have to do is remove your check-in, that's probably an easier thing for them to deal with than rebooking you. Other staff may not have the authority to rebook you, but they might be able to clear out the check-in so that you can let the phone agents finalize the rebooking process. All right, so that is pretty much it for Fritz's story. Everything fortunately worked out well, with the exception that he did get delayed in Paris for a full day until the next outbound flight, but he was able to get rebooked and able to get home to Miami. Thanks again, Fritz, for letting me share the story. It was much appreciated, and hopefully you guys got some benefit as well. There's one other component to this that I wanted to share, because I recently had a American Airlines flight on my way back to Detroit. Had a trip home just recently, and the night before departure, I got an email from American Airlines saying that my flight to Charlotte for the connection to Detroit was canceled. Now, the reason I bring this up is that it's really important to differentiate between the airline operating the flight and the airline that booked your ticket. So I used British Airways points to book this ticket, but American was operating my flight. So in this situation, I should have called British Airways to see if they could rebook my ticket. That's, sort of the best practice way to go, because generally the airline operating your flight, if it's booked by another frequent flyer program, they don't have the same level of control over the ticket. And so they're basically just going to redirect you to go deal with British Airways in my case. Fortunately, I broke that rule and called American first because I really wanted to fly to Lansing instead. And I saw that they had some flights open through Chicago. So Austin, Chicago to Lansing. That's a big time savings so that I didn't have to drive from Detroit to get back. And so I asked American if they could rebook me to Lansing. And I think I may have just gotten a bit lucky getting a really helpful, great agent for American Airlines, because like I said, normally she probably wouldn't be able to change the existing ticket. What she ended up doing is just rebooking me on a revenue fare for free. So I think she just basically threw away the British Airways reservation and rebooked me on a paid ticket that got me to Lansing. And so that was super helpful. And it's a good thing to keep in mind, even though best practice is to call the program or the airline that booked your ticket. Sometimes the airline operating the flight can find a way to sort it out if you get the right agent. The other thing I learned in this process is a little bit more about the insurance benefits for cancellations and delays. We've talked in the past, the City Prestige card used to have the best coverage because they offered a compensation after a 3-hour delay, but they've since changed that policy and moved it in line with most of the other premium rewards cards, where you get $500 per passenger if you're delayed by 6 hours or more, or you have to do an overnight. So I was looking at the insurance benefits because although I was really happy to fly to Lansing instead, I had booked a non-refundable car rental in Detroit to drive to Lansing. And so I was hoping that my insurance coverage would take care of that. But unfortunately, because the delay was less than 6 hours, I wasn't going to be eligible for any compensation. And I also learned that the delay is timed from how long it takes from the time you were supposed to depart to the time that you actually depart. It has nothing to do with when you arrive. This was for the Chase Sapphire Reserve card, but I suspect that that probably applies to most of the card insurance, that they measure the delay for that purpose based on the departure time rather than the arrival time. So that's something that's good to know when you're rebooking a ticket. If you find something that gets you in, potentially earlier or is actually a better itinerary, that you don't have to worry about missing out on your $500 compensation because your arrival time isn't 6 hours late. It really has to do with your departure time. And that's something that, for most people, maybe you just want to get out of there and get to your destination as quick as possible. But when you're researching those alternative options, keep in mind that if you got an alternative option that results in a 5.5 hour delay and an alternative option that results in a 6 hour and 10 minute delay, you want to take that 6 hour and 10 minute delay and treat yourself to a nice hotel, go to a restaurant, spend a little bit of that $500 delay benefit. All right, that is it for the core content. Thank you guys very much for joining me for this week's episode. This week's international jam is a track by Abi the Nomad. This guy is the son of a diplomat and spent 25 years globetrotting. I really dig the track. It's called Somebody to Love. I hope you guys enjoy it as well, and I will see you in a couple of weeks. Wherever you are, travel safe.
Another coupon in the mailbox. Another bus, another train track. Another broken stained mattress where my brain rots.
Hey brothers, don't be shy. Hop over to the website and join our email list for exclusive travel hacking content. If you like what we're up to, the best way you can support the show is by leaving us a 5-star review on iTunes. Lastly, we would love to hear from you, so send your show feedback to Eric or AJ at abroaders.com. We will see you next week.
You stay in front and all around in my face, wishing we were apart.